Well, welcome all you wiretappers back here in studio of Gangland Wire. I have a show for you today, a little different look at organized crime history. Now, we know there was a big Jewish segment, shall we say, of La Cosa Nostra. I'm not really delved into it. Everybody knows the name of Mayor Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, but there was a lot more people, especially connected to Murder Incorporated. So I have here a man who's written an insider's, if you will, look at that early um, Jewish faction of especially the New York City organized crime and Murder Incorporated, Allen Geik. Allen, I really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you so much for having me on Gangland Wire, Gary.
And now, Allen, you have quite an interesting career here, as well as the way you grew up. And we'll talk more about what happened to you growing up or what your family was like. But you've got a novel out there, Glenfiddich's Inn. You've produced Grammy-nominated music in the Latin genre. You have hosted radio shows yourself in Los Angeles. You've edited films. You have and you've got all that creative stuff. You also have a master's from the London School of Economics and Political Science.
That was another lifetime.
And you wrote articles about the bank bailouts in 2008. So, I mean, you are a man for all seasons, my friend.
Thank you. Actually, it was quite a journey and a lot of adventures along the way, I'm sure you've had to say.
Well, that's how I'd like to live my life. So I got a copy of Allen's book and I read it and before it was actually published in PDF form in order to make some comments. And I've got some other comments that people have made about your book. Your book is Uncle Charlie Killed Dutch Schultz. And there's a tagline after that. Remind me of that tagline after.
The Jewish Mob, a Family Affair.
There you go. Here's one from Avi Bash. He said, Uncle Charlie Killed Dutch Schultz is a gripping story of family and crime. Geik does a magnificent job expanding on familiar stories by adding personal insight obtained directly from the infamous characters portrayed throughout the book. Here's another one. Magnificent storytelling, masterfully written, and engaging insight into the powerful Jewish crime syndicate and the role they played in 20th century organized crime. So a must have for any mob enthusiast. So folks, I'll have links to that book on the show notes. And as you can see, if you're watching on YouTube, you see a cover of the copy and I'll have a link down there in the description of what we're going to talk about here. So Allen, how'd you get started on this project? It's like a family history is my understanding.
Yes, it came out as a family history. I never really intended to write it. It was just part of a family story. Mm. But about 4 years ago, a cousin of mine, a favorite cousin, called me and he was ecstatic. He insisted I go to the computer and go to a website. And I went to it. It was an organized crime website, which I don't even think I went to very much at the time. And there was a picture on the homepage of a 1930s era police lineup with the men with fedora hats and overcoats. You know, you've seen 100.
Oh, yeah.
and I said, okay, so what? He said, my father's on the right. And his father, a favorite uncle of mine 20 years later, I didn't recognize him in the picture from the 30s, was a small-time criminal, lovable, but he had a long police record of bounced checks and mail fraud and larceny and all of that stuff. And I said, okay. And he said, look who's on the cover. My father, not Uncle George, not Uncle Charlie, not Sammy Cassup, all the people who I wound up writing about. So I laughed. We had a good laugh over it. And a few weeks later, I went to see my sister, an attorney in Boston, who I told her the story of my conversation with our cousin. And she said, I have all those photos.
Oh, really?
Here, and I had nothing. I had traveled the world. And I looked through them, and the photos just gave a certain life to that part of our family history. There was Johnny Dioguardi with my father and a whole line of men sitting at a table, and there was my father and Sammy Cassup, who we always thought was the most hardened criminal of all of them.
Yeah.
But there was pictures of Sammy Cassup with my mother holding her around. He loved my mother. He loved all of us. And I said, somehow this should be put down on paper. And my cousins, who knew of these people but never knew them personally because they were younger, they just insisted that I write it. So as I started writing it, one thing jumped out at me was I started with my Uncle George and his lifelong co-conspirator and friend, Ruby Collard, just burglarizing a dry goods store on the Lower East Side. And as the story progressed, 40 years later, who would have thought but Ruby Collard would be the president of the Desert Inn and asking Howard Hughes to leave, and Howard Hughes wound up buying it. And also, my Uncle George at that time would be Sam Giancana and Trigger Mike Coppola's stand-in in Las Vegas for the Skim, because both of them were on the blacklist and couldn't go to Las Vegas. So they both trusted and had lifelong relationships with Uncle George. So who would have thought from that very beginning of a small burglary but that was parallel to what happened to organized crime. That was sort of a metaphor for all of organized crime that started in the Prohibition. They went through the Depression. They went through World War II, and they thrived throughout all of those national challenges. So I just kept writing it and becoming more interested in how all these pieces fit together, which I never really gave much thought to before. I have to say one more thing, Gary. Yeah. What amazed me when I started it was I looked for context, for historical context. I mean, I knew the story of the killings of this one or that one, but I looked for a bigger context, and I found what I didn't even know existed: crime researchers and crime reporters and podcasters. And I didn't know that whole world existed.
Yeah, it's quite a world. It is getting bigger and more detailed all the time. You know, as a friend of mine, FBI agent here in Kansas City, who actually was the case agent on the big skimming case that started in Kansas City that took down Chicago, Cleveland, and Milwaukee. And we were talking about the early days in Kansas City, and we had a guy named Nick Savella was the boss, and it was all the Cosa Nostra. But then they also had a guy named Max Jabin and Morris Klein, who were really important in the gambling end. And he said, the Italians were the brawn and the Jewish guys were the brains here in Kansas City. And so I think there's the same thing all over the United States.
It's funny you said that, because one of the characters in my story who I knew my whole life, Johnny Ito, who was a fence, the least violent of all of them, but he had access to Mayor Walker in the 20s and Mayor O'Dwyer in the 40s, and he was also selling jewelry to everybody. And he was a friend of Frank Costello, and he claimed, and I believe him because he wouldn't lie about it, he said Frank Costello said they put Jews in as the Jews were the labor union presidents because they had better table manners.
There you go. A little bit more sophisticated. No offense to any of my Sicilian Italian friends out there, but that's just kind of the way it was. And I think they'd all agree with that.
And they're sort of gentle stereotypes.
Yeah. But your Jewish gangster was not really always that gentle. He may have had good table manners, but there's a certain underground there, especially when it comes to Murder Incorporated. You're talking about your uncle killing Dutch Schultz, and he was really well known as an angry, violent, vicious guy. So, tell us some of those little stories that you dug up.
Well, Charlie killed Dutch Schultz in 1935. He got arrested in 1941 when Abe Relis and they were all attacking a lot of them got arrested. He did 23 years in jail. And when he got out of jail, he was very close to my family because my father was one of the many, I assume, men who brought money to his family because my father was a civilian. He had no police record. They were concerned about criminals coming, and they just wanted to keep it as clean as possible. And my parents knew Charlie and his wife before they went to jail and after. And my brother was close to him because my brother was a detective and offered him some, what would you call it, he helped him if there were any parole issues. And he always referred to me as his nephew and my brother as his nephew. And the man that I saw, I knew the man you were just describing, and that was certainly there. But the man I saw was interesting. He had great insights into the criminal mind going back then. And a lot of these people, by the time I was an adult, they wanted what a lot of semi-retired people always long for, camaraderie. And they had family. They saw us as family, and the stories came and the reminiscence, and all I had to do was sit back. And years later, I interviewed my brother after most of these people passed away because I wanted to get some kind of a record of it. And so I was able to access that when I started writing this more recently. My brother passed away in 2008, but I was lucky to have our remembrances in some kind of a written form for the minor details of the story I wrote. But Charlie was, I could see when he walked into places, and now we're talking about 1970s, say the late 60s, early 70s, when he walked into a place, people knew who he was. And he had been in jail for 23 years. And yet they treated him more as an equal than as someone to fear or anything else. He was, all of them, including Meyer Lansky, to me, they were just older Jewish men, like the men in my neighborhood who we all had great respect for. We would always call them Mr. whatever their name was. We would never call them by their first name, except Charlie was always Uncle Charlie. But
what was Charlie's last name?
Workman.
Workman, okay. And so Charlie Workman, and was he was connected to Murder Incorporated, right?
He was one, according to what I later read and what I heard from family members, he was one of the go-to guys who they called upon, and actually they called upon him to kill Dutch Schultz, who was a big problem for them, but also a mob boss. So he must have been high up on the go-to list.
Yeah, he must have been. Now, how did that, I wonder how that went down. Now, the tie-ins, Albert Anastasia was famous for this Murder Incorporated, but most of the killers that he recruited into that and used were Jewish guys, is my understanding.
That's right. And a lot of them, well, there were Italians in it. Actually, Louis Capone, who wasn't related to Al Capone, who wound up getting the electric chair.
Right. He was one of the few.
They were Jewish guys who went and did the jobs. And they didn't call it Murder Incorporated until they started rounding everyone else up. And an enterprising reporter for a New York newspaper, when they called it the combination. But once all these stories of how many people they actually killed, they called it Murder Incorporated, and the name stuck forever after. But Charlie got turned in by one of the other members, Abe Rellis, who wound up getting thrown out of a 6th-floor window in a hotel in Coney Island.
What was the saying at the time? The canary could sing but couldn't fly.
Correct. That's right. And, it was also matter of fact in my family, or that part of the family, because I remember when I was much younger, we were in Coney Island on the boardwalk with a group of people, and someone pointed to the building, which I believe still exists.
Oh, really?
Geriatric Center or Senior Citizen Center, pointed to the building and said, "That's where Abe Rellis was thrown out of the window, and he landed over there." And I was 9 years old, and I said, "What do you mean?" And those were the kinds of things I would overhear. Like, you mean someone threw someone out of a 6-story
Really?
window? And it was said with a very matter-of-fact attitude.
Interesting. That is interesting. Growing up in that culture, I guess, and where something like that would be matter of fact.
Yeah, it was. It was sort of like the family could have been all in big band musicians talking on the road or something like that.
So, kind of during that, when Charlie Workman went to jail and Abe Relis started ratting everybody out, what was the mood in your family, and do you remember much of that? Or
well, I wasn't around when that happened, when Abe Relis was informing on everybody, but one of the people who I spoke to at some length about was the fence who I mentioned, Johnny Eder, who was right in City Hall for almost his whole career in Brooklyn and New York. That was an interesting story, and I told about it in the book. But he was close to William O'Dwyer, who was probably one of the more interesting characters. William O'Dwyer came from Ireland. He was a laborer. He became a policeman, and then he became the Brooklyn district attorney. All he wanted to do was be mayor of New York, which he wound up being after the war. But as the DA, he put out stories about all these Murder Incorporated guys who were informing on each other when it wasn't always true. Johnny Eden knew that this was going on, so did other people. But it made everybody so nervous that they came in to inform too, because back then they had the death sentence.
Yeah.
And a number of them did get the death sentence and did get executed at Sing Sing. Lepke and Uncle Charlie's partner on the Dutch Schultz hit was Mendy Weiss. And Mendy Weiss got executed for another murder. So it was serious business, and everybody started to come in to inform. And it was really a ruse by William O'Dwyer, the DA.
Very interesting. He was Thomas Dewey before there was a Thomas Dewey. He was a mob buster. He was going to make his political career on the backs of mobsters.
Actually, he turned up a few years later in another role. As soon as they cleaned up Murder Incorporated, and it was going very quickly, he joined the military. He went to Italy, and I think he was an intelligence officer, but he became part of the Allied Commission in Italy. And he came back and ran for mayor and won. And at that time, they was trying to get arms to the people fighting in Israel. And the way they got it was they owned the docks. The Jewish and Italian mobsters and the Irish were a large part of the workforce on the docks, and they hated the British. So they were more than happy to help get all this weaponry. And there was Mayor O'Dwyer, an Ireland-born mayor who could speak to the Irish workers and say, we're on the side of the people fighting for the state of Israel. And the amount of weaponry they got off the port of New York was immense. And Johnny Eder told me that Mayor O'Dwyer said to him, "These days I'm more of a Jew than you are, John."
That is really interesting. Kind of remember that. And folks, you need to maybe go watch Exodus or something to kind of get a sense of the history and the relationship between the British and the people in Israel, the Jewish people in Israel, and trying to form a state. And the British, they wanted to hang on to their, what they call it, protectorate, almost like a colony over there. And they finally start easing them out. But the Jewish people needed guns in order to help get the British out and deal with the Arabs at the time. So it was an interesting bit of history there that we're connected to.
And there was another layer of difficulty, and that was that the United States sanctioned any arms going to the Israeli fighters as the British did, but they both supported the Arabs with weaponry because they wanted the Arab oil.
Right. It was already started.
They had to fight against a sanction. People in the United States did go to jail for violating whatever the sanction was against Israel. And so it was a serious offense. So they had to fight for the state, but they also had to fight the British and American governments who were decidedly on the side of the Arabs at the time.
Yeah, interesting. Now, at what point in time after then Harry Truman recognized Israel?
And that was a surprise. He recognized them almost immediately. And I had a fortuitous relationship. My late father-in-law, the father of my late wife, was the first fighter pilot in the Israeli Air Force. Through Leonard, he was a pilot in the Marine Corps during World War II. He was he left Hungary because of the anti-Semitism, and he joined the Marines, and he wound up being the first fighter pilot. But he was stationed in secret bases after World War II in Italy, and he witnessed and was a recipient of the mob's effect in Italy. They protected the secret bases from the British, who wanted them to be closed down. And during World War II, of all the countries in Europe, the country that was most supportive and protective of the Jews was Italy. And when we hear the expression stand-up person, which we all know, he's a stand-up guy, imagining an Italian family in Italy under the Gestapo who are not telling the Gestapo where the Jews are.
Yeah.
And women and children, that's stand-up.
Yeah, that's stand-up. That's for sure. I think especially in southern Italy and Sicily, they had a long tradition of standing up against any authority that came in from the outside. That's bred into their bones.
And also they had a long history of dealing with Jews and Phoenicians and people, because those were the first seafarers. And they put down in southern Italy and surely in Sicily. So they had a history going back 1,500 years.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Interesting. Well, all around that Mediterranean, and of course, Jewish people were a huge part of that whole Mediterranean trade going back, and really what produced our modern society was a trade around the Mediterranean, because that was the Western world at the time.
Absolutely.
And so much history here. So it's, what about any other organized crime? You got another story or two out of your book there that you'd like to tell people, kind of entice them to want to buy this book?
Well, as I mentioned, Uncle George was an interesting character. As I mentioned, he and Ruby started off with at least my story starts off with a dry goods burglary, and they become major players in Las Vegas. But the story of Havana was interesting too, because in the 30s, Meyer Lansky pretty much bought into Havana and paid off Fulgencio Batista, who was on and off the military dictator of Cuba. And the Cleveland Syndicate, which my uncle and Ruby both became big parts of, they wound up running the casino at the Havana Nacional. And I found even though I read different people were given credit for running the casino, the FBI reports, I did get a lot of Freedom of Information Act reports from the FBI. And there it was, Uncle George and Sam Tucker from the Cleveland Syndicate were the major players at the Havana Nacional. And they sensed that the game was over for gambling, because while Meyer Lansky ran it all, he was around, was the story I've been told, and history bears it out. Meyer Lansky was around Batista and the generals. Uncle George, Sam Tucker, and the people running the casino were out in the street. They loved the night, and they could see that Castro was winning the war. In the street, the people were, whenever there was a victory in the east coast of Cuba, the people were thrilled about it. So they wanted to get out. And also they had built the Stardust in Las Vegas. And they said, why be here with all of this insecurity and of who's going to run and who's going to win when we have this cash cow in Las Vegas? And luckily at that time, the Las Vegas or the Nevada Gaming Commission put out a ruling that if you invested, they didn't want to leave because they didn't want to leave Meyer Lansky walk away from him. That would have taken, and that was some of Godfather too, actually.
Right.
But they were lucky because they didn't want to leave, but the ruling was if you were invested in Las Vegas, you can't be invested in Havana. So, boy, they looked for someone to buy them out quickly, and so they could keep their Las Vegas interests and get out gracefully out of Cuba. And they found a guy 2 months before the revolution happened. They got out with all their cash.
Wow.
Havana 2 months before. And the guy who got stuck with it was himself a scammer of sorts. And he claimed to be a golf partner of the then President Kennedy. That was a story that had many different tellings of that story that I've read, but that was one that the FBI documents bore out, the one that I heard when I was much younger.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, Las Vegas was built. Bugsy Siegel was already out there, and Gus Greenbaum and Mo Dalis from Cleveland, and then these guys from Havana sell out and get out early and get. It's like selling a house in 2007 in the United States.
Right.
So, yeah, interesting. That is great. That's a good story there. That's really, part of the modern day organized crime. That was the route, through gambling, that prohibition through gambling. They started out with the carpet joints and go to throughout the United States, and then also the Havana, and then go to Las Vegas, which, that story tells itself. That's a huge story, just the Las Vegas alone.
And for the first time, it was legal.
Yeah.
These guys who had been spent by that point from 1925 to 1950 building out illegal gambling casinos and bribing local officials in every county in Ohio and Kentucky. All of a sudden, they had legal gambling, and they still had to skim. So they invented skimming because they didn't have that before. Now they had to, being it was legal, they had to pay taxes. So they invented skimming, which we've heard a lot about and saw movies about.
Right. And everybody hates to pay taxes, especially mob guys. Yeah, those carpet joints. I have an author that has a real detailed book about gambling before Las Vegas, and he goes into all those carpet joints, and he told me, he said, when they started building up Las Vegas and it got popular, the local people out there, they didn't know how to run a casino. They didn't know how to make money in a casino. He said, but the people have been running the carpet joints throughout the United States. They brought them out, and they were gravitated to that, and they knew how to make money. And of course, the rest is history, as we see.
And even years later, when Ruby Collard told Howard Hughes people to leave, and he turned around and bought the Desert Inn and 5 or 6 other properties, he made the mistake of leaving the same people in charge of the casino, the people who were skimming for years, and they cared less about Howard Hughes than they did about the mob.
Yeah.
And one of them told me, my first trip to Las Vegas in 1976, one of the casino pit bosses, Peanuts, his name was, he came from Cleveland. I was there with my father. And he said, what did we care about Howard Hughes and these retired FBI agents? Yeah. We were as blind as we could. We would have never done that when the mob guys were in charge. And so Howard Hughes left 2 years later.
Yeah.
There's some discrepancies in that story too, but that's the one that I heard firsthand.
Yeah, interesting. All right, Allen Geik. This has been a great interview, and it's an interesting book. I've read it and went through it, and it's a really great read, guys. So I really appreciate you coming on, Allen.
Thank you so much for having me, Gary. I appreciate it.
All right. Repeat the name of your book, Allen.
Uncle Charlie Killed Dutch Schultz, The Jewish Mob, A Family Affair.
All right, folks, be sure and get that. And don't forget, look out for motorcycles when you're out on the road. And if you feel like you or a relative or somebody you care about has a problem with PTSD, they're a vet, go to the Veterans Administration website and get their hotline and get some help there. I really appreciate it. You can always support me on Venmo or buy me a cup of coffee. And tune in. Tell a friend about this show. That's how I get more listeners. More listeners I get, the more I like it. Thanks a lot, you guys. Thanks a lot, you guys. Thanks a lot, you guys. Thanks a lot.